All right, welcome everybody. I see we have plenty of people that are rolling in. Today, we have the PBIS teaming series, specifically looking at communicating across all stakeholders. My name is Rebecca Webster. I will be your host for today, and I have the wonderful Dr. Stephanie Martinez, Dr. Laura Kern, and Mrs. Robin Vanover will be your speakers for today. All right, I'm going to go ahead and hand it on over to you, ladies.
Thank you, Rebecca. I'm Stephanie Martinez. I'm going to be starting out the series today, PBIS Team Series, Communicating Across All Stakeholders. We're going to have the opportunity to do some chatting in the chat box today. And I know Rebecca is going to help monitor that for us, since when you're presenting, you can't see that screen. So hope to get a lot of participation in that chat box today. This is what we sat down and decided that we hope our participants get out of today's chat. So here are our objectives of what we hope to cover in today's chat. So we have our first chat box already. For some participation, we have 3 questions on the screen. If you would open up your chat box and answer these questions. Question number 1 is, who currently sits on your PBIS team? So what are the roles of the individuals that sit on your team? Do you have teachers, administrators? Who are those individuals? The second question is, after drafting ideas of PBIS implementation, which stakeholders do you share ideas with to get feedback? So, you know, your PBIS team is usually a small subset of your school. So who do you then take those drafted ideas to get some feedback? And then the third question is, are there any groups of individuals whom the school PBIS team does not currently get feedback from on what's drafted during that team meeting, but should reach out to? So is there anyone missing on your team that you think you need to go reach and get some feedback on what your team drafts? So with that, I'm going to give a little bit of wait time and see what we get in the chat box.
All right, so Sarah says that they have teachers, non-instructional staff, and at least 1 administrator on their team. Jane has cross-section of staff and admin, missing families and community members. Sabrina has teachers, behavior specialists, MTSS coach, ESE teachers, assistant principal, and para. Margot has AP, grade level reps, and staff students need more ideas for parents. All right. Oh, and social worker, guidance counselor. Yep, those are all great ideas for team members. Oh, and one more here, administrators, teachers, support staff, and need some more input from parents. Social worker, teachers, MTSS, instructional staff specialist. All right.
Thank you, Rebecca, for reading those. So it sounds like from what we've seen so far from the chat box, and thank you for your participation, that we have currently on most of our PBIS teams good school representation across your campuses. But it sounds like from what I've seen that the individuals that are missing, we saw a lot about families and parents. So we'll give you some strategies today to work on getting that communication back with our families, but really specific to what's going on with changes in school due to COVID. So first we want to define, because we did talk about communication with stakeholders, who are our stakeholders? And so when we think about stakeholders with PBIS, we all said already the common people that we think of, which are the school staff, employees. But we also want to make sure that when we're thinking about our PBIS plans, making changes to it, revising it, and implement it, we also want the input of our students, our family members, and our community members. It's extremely important too to consider our students as they get older, because they definitely have their own thoughts and opinions about things, and we want to make sure that we get them bought in. By including all of these stakeholders, we're making sure that we're having partnerships on our campus and that our policies and practices and our PBS systems are culturally responsive to the staff and students and families in the community that we serve. I know a lot of times a lot of the plans are developed solely by the PBS team. And so it's nice to reach out to those other stakeholders so that we have a good contextual fit and good cultural fit for the communities that we serve. We also know, as I said a second ago, with students, we want to make sure that they're buying into the system. And one good way to make sure that they're buying in is getting some input from students to make sure that we're really meeting their needs as well. So these are the who. We want to make sure that we have this representation not only on tier 1, but also tier 2 and tier 3. I also want to challenge you too to think about all of our staff. And so we do have a lot of times our special education staff that are itinerant. So we might have a social worker or a school psychologist who's only at our school 1 or 2 days a week. We might share a PT or an OT with another school to get their buy-in as well. So we just want to make sure that we have everybody represented. And when we talk about families and students, we want to make sure that we have representation from all types of families and all types of students. So across grade levels, across gender, across students with and without disabilities. Maybe some of our families are students that are not typically involved. So going beyond student government, going beyond PTA, going beyond SAC to make sure we're hitting all populations of our students and families. So here's another opportunity in the chat box. So we want to know currently in what ways are students involved in developing and or giving input and feedback on the 10 critical elements of Tier 1 PBIS. So think about your current system. How are you getting that feedback? And if you're currently not having any practices or policies in place and procedures on getting that ongoing feedback from students, if you would let us know that as well too.
Okay. Student surveys, student votes, fun survey monkey is clever ways for them to vote. Let's see, more student surveys, interviews. We enlist the help of our Student Government Association or pick random classes to offer ideas. Students choose monthly incentives. Anybody else? We are currently not in school, but plan on completing surveys when we return with our new academic model. That's awesome, Judith. Student surveys via SurveyMonkey and forms, input from student council.
Okay, thank you for everybody who shared. We hear a lot from what I've heard from you as student surveys, interviewing, student council. I would also suggest, if you haven't thought about it, having a student PBIS team or a student PBIS representative on your PBIS team. So here are some different examples. Some of them are families, some of them are students, but I want to highlight the 3 in the middle. So these are some examples of what some schools have done to really mesh in student involvement and leadership with PBIS and input. So at one specific high school, the leadership team was asked to problem solve appropriate ways for students to make suggestions for changes and how to engage in that. That revolved around some protesting, and so instead of doing a walk out, they did a walk in with a town hall meeting, and the students had the opportunity to suggest some changes that they would like to see on campus. Another one was a high school that had a PBIS leadership elective, and so it was a broad group of students from 9th through 12th grade, some who had disabilities, some who didn't, different races, ethnicities, some who were on track for graduation, some who were off track, so a whole broad range of students. And one of the students had the idea to do a QR code and posted those on campus. They had questions posted, so every week to 2 weeks, and the students could scan the QR code and answer the question. Then the information was gathered in a Google Drive, and it was shared back with the administration and PBIS team about student input. One of their main goals by doing that was to be able to have input from lots of students, not just students in that specific class. It was a senior's idea to do that. So what happened is they paired him with a sophomore, I believe it was, so that when he graduated that year, then the sophomore could continue it the following year, and then he would be paired up with either a freshman or sophomore to continue it after he left. So you can see these are some just different ways that schools have really truly gone above and beyond to get that active participation and input from large groups of students. So when we think about obtaining student input, some different considerations. A lot of times when we think about student input, we think about sharing information, which is one-way communication from the school to the student. We also want to think about obtaining input. So not just sharing information, but seeking input from the students about how they can make school better. Now we know that school's going to look a little bit different this year. Most school districts in the state of Florida are still going to have that traditional school, but some are also going to have students virtual, and those students may come in and out throughout the year. So some things to consider if we're sharing information at the traditional format, we want to make sure that we share the information school-wide for all students. So it's not just to student government and then expecting student government to share to all students. Making sure we have avenues and formats that access students. So if you look at the bottom, it says same information, different formats in green. What we sometimes experience is if you go to your email, you get one piece of information. If you go to the school website, you get a different piece of information. So we want to make sure there's multiple ways of sharing information to students and what they're going to access. So is it social media? Is it TikTok? Is it Facebook? What are students going to access? But even though we're using different formats, we're sharing the same information. I know as a parent, I have 5 different avenues for accessing information, and the information is different on 5 different avenues. So if I want all the information, I have to go to all 5 different places. Our students may not be willing to do that. So we just want to make sure that we're sharing the same information, but maybe in different ways. When we're thinking about virtual school, we want to make sure if we're sharing information, we know which students are actually receiving the information and which ones are not. So is there a way to ask a question and they answer it, and they maybe a bonus point, and that's how we know that they've answered the question? Maybe it's part of a class assignment, so we make sure that we know that. We've also seen some schools where they are doing their virtual platform and they have a course or something called PBIS, or I've seen it for SEL as well. And so they have that module where the students can click on, and it has that information there as well. So that is some suggestions and things to consider if we're sharing. Now, if we're trying to obtain input, here are some things that we want to think about. At our traditional school, we want to make sure that all students have the opportunity to provide input. So if we're just going to things like student government, we may not hit all types of students on our campus. We might not be accessing our students with disabilities. Maybe we're not accessing students who are off track. And we want to make sure that we're getting input from everybody. So how are we going to do that? And so the example of the QR code was one way that they did that. Now, if we're thinking about students at virtual school, we want to make sure that we're tracking who actually provides input so that we know which students are non-responsive to being offered the opportunity to provide input. And if over time they're continuing to be non-responsive, what are some different ways we can, things we can do to make sure that we're trying to get that back? And so that's looking at the different subgroups to make sure there's representation. And if we have a subgroup of students, say maybe students who are in 9th grade at a high school that we're not getting feedback from, how can we target our efforts to make sure we're getting that information? Here's just some additional considerations at the bottom. So here's just another example. It's not necessarily PBIS related, but it's just a good example of how we can get input from our students. So this was a 10th grade teacher, and she wanted to find out from her students what they liked and did not like about her online learning, so that she could make it better. And so she reached out to her students, and this is essentially what they said. So she was able to modify what she was doing based on the feedback that she got from her students. That's essentially what we're asking you to do, is figure out how to get that input from our students and then make some modifications and changes to meet their needs. Here's an activity that we've started doing in our Tier 1 training. It's just another example. This is about our reward system. It gives teams an opportunity to really plot out what are the current strategies they're using to reward students. It asks them to identify who's using it, what's the frequency of it, and then making sure that all of our students are accessing those rewards. So one of the comments is our sections about students with multiple discipline events. So are they able to access the rewards? And if you have low participation across all of those, then we really need to consider if our Tier 1 reward system is accessible by all students. And if not, what can we do to ensure that we're meeting the needs of the students who do receive multiple discipline incidents and encourage them to participate and meet our school-wide expectations and rules. So here's a bigger picture of that, so you can see what that looks like. Here's some other ideas and suggestions as well, and several of you mentioned those already in the chat box earlier about ways of getting input. So the big thing here we want to find out is, if we're talking about reward systems, what do the students want? And then trying to meet their needs. I had the opportunity last year to meet with high school students at 3 different high schools, and it was really interesting to see what they wanted. And some of the stuff the school had an idea about, some of them they did not. One of the schools, the students really wanted a cool off setting where they could go calm down if they wanted to, and most people would probably tend to think that would be elementary school. Some of the other things that the students talked about is they liked the hoodies that were being offered, but they wanted them in multiple colors and multiple designs, where currently it was just one design and one color, and they suggested having students do a competition for those. So those are some just different ways of doing it, and here's some possible strategies, but some ways to get some input.
Hello, everyone. So now we're going to shift focus to our families, which we found with COVID and the remote learning and now hybrid and all the flexibility we've had to have in schools and in our families, that some of what families think and how they're reacting to COVID is really impacting our school and our education. So in the chat box, if you can think of how are you engaging with families currently on any of the features of PBIS, either input or feedback, if you can add some, that would be awesome.
All right, Sarah created a YouTube channel. Jane said through newsletter, Facebook page, family nights. Sabrina says through surveys, town hall meetings, and family nights. Margot said PTO page. Judith said a few of our schools offered videos on the school website with behavioral strategies and at-home reinforcement plans during COVID. Victoria said, surveyed our parents at the beginning and end of last school year to compare input and revise our practices.
These are all really great ideas, and I really like the fact that you can use these in both the in-school settings, and you can also adapt them to virtual settings. And then if you have a hybrid, you can kind of use both. So these are all really great ideas that you guys are currently doing. So we looked at this slide before when we talked about our family and student collaboration, but we also want to think about how are we collaborating with our families. So one of the really great ways is thinking about social media and Twitter. Perhaps we've sent some information home or given some videos for families on some of the PBIS strategies or expectations, but we don't know if they're using them or the level of engagement. Well, we can send an email message or something on Twitter or Facebook and ask them to share what they've done at home, and then they can then provide more discussion. You can see this this one on the right is on using effective statements. So this assumes that you are using effective statements as a PBIS strategy within the school. Now you're sharing it with home, and now you're asking the parents to try it at home and give us some perspective how it went and how did you use it, which you then can wrap around into your classroom. Some of these other ways are things that even though we're thinking about students, we also can think about, can we do the same thing for our families while we're working with our students? So can we ask our families to problem solve, to give some feedback? For example, on the dress code, there might be some cultural considerations that we're not thinking about when we put our rules in place in our schools. Maybe we need to reach out if we're showing that we're having problems with our discipline, our ODRs because of dress code violations. Maybe we need to have a conversation with our families and community members of why that might be. We might ask that if we're going to do something with the school for an assembly, maybe we want to have our families and community members participate in that and provide more perspective of what's going on outside of the school to make that homeschool communication going on. Now it's a little bit more complicated with COVID, but in the future, this is also some things to think about. And finally, again, that discipline data. Are we ever sharing that with families and asking their perspective? If we're showing that we're having too much discipline in one area, maybe it's a conversation we need to have with the families and our students. Again, that both of those to gain some insight on what their thoughts are on that and what other strategies they can come up with. Next slide, please. The other thing we want to think about is as we're applying our tiered logic to school-wide, we also want to think about it in terms of our family engagement. So much like how we're tailoring instruction for most kids, some kids, and a few kids, we can think of that for also our families. What are some universal tier 1 strategies we can do? Perhaps we have a lot of trauma in our community, and maybe we need to have some sort of awareness conferences or something about that information. Can we connect on social media to a broader audience of families? Can we do surveys to all our families? Strength-based phone calls. So not just when the child has done something wrong, but perhaps as a class, if the class has done something really great, you would contact the families and say, hey, this is really great. We're having this really great thing in school, or we really wanted to share some really positive things that are going on. And then again, working with communities. I know I've seen, especially in rural areas where sometimes resources are scarce, they'll ask different communities agencies to partner with them and bring in assemblies. For example, a sheriff's department might be able to do something on addressing bullying and work with the school on that. And then we have, for a few families that might need a little bit more support, perhaps we need to know what is the language that some of these families would need, and maybe we have some support in schools for that. Maybe they need help with transportation, and it depends on what's allowable, but sometimes some families do not have babysitters and would like to go to the PTO meeting. How can we help support those families? Maybe we need to have focus groups. And then we also think about our few families that might need even more. So perhaps we have a resource night or open house, but we have families that are not coming. Maybe they need a personal email reminding them of its coming and that you're looking forward to talking to them. or even sometimes positive home visits, depending on what the school will allow. A little bit more complicated with COVID right now. But again, overall, think of this as a tiered structure, much as we do with our instruction and our behavior, that we're also thinking about that and how we're communicating with our families based on their needs. So then we think about the how. How do we assess if our families are engaged? I know I hear a lot about, well, why bother? Because like only 2 or 3 families are going to participate anyway. And those are the ones we always see. And we love those families, but the rest of them aren't going to bother. Maybe it's because we haven't really totally thought about how they can do this. Are we using a language? If we have a population where we have a lot of Spanish being spoken, are we communicating all of our activities in that language? Do we know about our culture? Are we just assuming that we have a certain culture? Are we asking our families for their input on how culture and context impacts our PBIS systems? And do they have access? I know right now we like to think about surveys. Well, if you're looking at remote instruction and technology is an issue, assuming we even have a laptop and internet, are families able to access the internet to do the surveys? If you have a family that's using a phone, if you have a survey, will it work on the phone? So kind of like you use whatever platform you use, but test it out on the phone and see if the buttons will work on that phone. Otherwise, I know I've gotten a couple that have popped up, and if it doesn't work, I just exit out. It's not because I'm not engaged and want to be engaged, it just doesn't work for me. So we think about this communication survey on the right. So we have a preferred method of contact. How do our families want to engage? Do they use Facebook? If you're providing information on Facebook but nobody's using it, then we're not really reaching our families. Do we use surveys? Do they like phone calls, texts, emails? What do they use? How often do they want to know information? Some families might want it all the time, but I know especially during the pandemic, I was getting so much information all the time that if I had been asked, I would have been like, can we please put it on weekly rather than daily in that beginning of that shutdown? The preferred language. What language is your population using, and do we have material for that? And then also preferred time. If you're trying to contact them and you're always trying to call during the middle of a work day and somebody is never home, it could be that they're not getting back to you because they can't get back to you during work hours. So that's just something to think about across. Are we engaged because we don't want to be engaged? Are we not? Are our families not being engaged because they can't engage the way that we want them to? So we need to assess that. And then finally, we start thinking about how are we obtaining input? We have that sharing of information, more passive, that we're giving it. And we also have the obtaining, that we're actively seeking their feedback. So for sharing information, for traditional schools, we think about in-person settings, we think about our open house events. We think about, do we allow parents on campus and are they there? For virtual, Stephanie had mentioned that she's got 5 or 6 places to be checking information. So are we just putting it on the student platform? How are we getting that information? And then of course, we're also thinking about, is that information consistent across the different places? I know at one point I was getting it from 5 different sources and I just stopped. By the time I hit the 3rd one, I was done. And if that information was not accurate and that by that time, then I was missing the information. And then also, do we have any modules virtually that we can share with our parents? Or are we able to, I know Florida PBIS, we had some in the beginning that we're happy to share, that you can share with your parents. Do they have access to that, to have that information? And then we think about input. Are we just asking our PTOs, our PTAs? I know I'm a parent of a student with a disability, and I went to the first PTO meeting when he was in elementary school, and after about 20 minutes, I realized that some of the information they were saying like didn't really apply. So I stopped going to PTOs. But that was the method that they were getting the information and feedback from families. So as a parent of a kid with a disability, my input was never going back into the school. and I kind of disengaged a little bit. And by the end, I wasn't going to open houses. And clearly I'm interested in education and family engagement, but because they weren't reaching out to me, I stopped engaging. So we want to think, who are we trying to access, and make sure that all families are included, and a variety of formats. And then also schedule ways to share input and ideas generated. If we do have places where families are coming together, maybe we can use that to reach them. And then what would work better for families? What do they want? What types of reward systems should be used? If you have a population that does not necessarily believe in reinforcing for coupons or something like that, it might not be that they don't think that reinforcement works. It might be that they think activities are better. Or maybe you need to have conversations with our families of what these systems are like and why we use them. How will you get their input? Again, will you use surveys or polls, or what is going to work for them? And how will you then bring that information into your decision making? So here's some possible strategies. We have surveys, and I noticed that a lot of people had used those, which are awesome. We have polls, maybe suggestion boxes, message boards, social media, using those existing meetings. The only thing, again, that I would mention is that if you're using multiple things, that be consistent in your message, and then also make sure it's working on the platforms that your families are using, and that they have internet access to be able to get that information, especially if we go remotely. Then we think about the magic, the implementation planning, how we're using the information and the feedback from our families and from our students to make sure that we're helping drive our decision making. And you'll notice that this is a circle. So it's not just one time. I know sometimes we like to survey families in the beginning or at the end of the year, and then we have how many months in between where there is no ongoing input. So you want to think about where and when we're trying to get the information, and we might want to even set dates for, 3 months into the school year, we're going to send another supplemental survey out to families to make sure that they're engaged in the process. And then there's nothing worse than taking a survey or being asked to be on a focus group, and I'm sure you guys have experienced that, and then nothing happens. You don't hear back. You don't know if they've used the information, or they make a decision that seems like that they didn't use your input at all. So that's something to think about. If we're doing these surveys and we're not using them to guide our decision making and to provide feedback to our PBIS process, then we have to think about, why are we asking our parents to begin with? We really want to think about how to use the information that we're gathering to connect better and provide better relationships with our schools. We want to think about organizing, focusing, and adjusting our plans. So for organizing, again, is what I had mentioned. What kind of data are we going to get? How are we going to get it? And whose feedback do we want? Our focus is, what needs to be different? What do we need to change? And are we sharing information with our families? And finally, adjusting our plans. And it does say that we're aiming for 80–90% support, which might be hard, again, with families to get. But even if you have less support, I would also say that as you're adjusting your plans, are you taking the information you have and using it? So even if you get 30% of your parents responding, are you actually using that information to drive your problem-solving process and make PBIS better for the families? And finally, what could this look like with stakeholders in general? And this could include our teams, this could include our families, this could include our students. So when we have a problem, do we review our data and identify where we want to make our changes? And then do we set some timelines for 2 weeks out? Maybe we're organizing the data sources we want, and we're making sure we have our questions and who we want to ask our questions of. At a 1 month out, maybe we're getting that stakeholder feedback. We've posted our survey. We have our information going. And then 6 weeks out, we're communicating the next steps to our stakeholders and making sure that they know that we're using that process. And again, you can see it's a cyclical process because it sometimes identifies more problems that you then want to go through and make sure that you have thought through. We want to think again of efficient and easy ways to communicate with technology, using standard templates. So if you've ever not had a form and you're doing data entry and you're trying to pick out the pieces from notes, it's very difficult. Perhaps we want to have a standard way that somebody could answer the questions, and then for data entry, they can just put it into a spreadsheet, so that way you can make decisions based off that. So you might want to do planning up ahead in front of the information on how you want that information to come in. You might want to think about who you can talk to. Are there some student leaders that other students would be more willing to talk to? Are there community leaders, are parents who are leaders within the organization from different groups that you can then say, we really want to get this information out and get the information back. How can you help us do that? Think about, again, the existing events that are happening, and then focus on one idea at a time. So if you want to have family or student input, perhaps you don't ask it about all of PBIS, but maybe you say, what do you think of our expectations? Do they represent the values of the school? And use that first. Break it down a little bit so it's not so intimidating on getting that feedback and incorporating it back into your PBIS process.
Thank you, Laura and Stephanie. This is Robin Vanover. I'm going to continue with the rest of the presentation. And I want to draw your attention to a guide that was published actually in June of 2020. And the guide is Returning to School During and After Crisis. And it provides a variety of different supports, starting at the state level and working its way down to the school and classroom level. So it's intended to help systems that are already established. And it's not a guide as a primer on MTSS or PBIS. So it's really helping those statewide systems, district systems, school-wide systems that are already implementing PBIS, and provides them with some adaptations and things to think about before, during, and after implementation phases. So starting at that state level, it's looking at those regional leadership teams that are coordinating trainings and coaching and evaluation, supporting our school districts. And if we think about what we've been experiencing since March, we've been looking to state leaders to help guide this process and to help inform us and to make better decisions at the local level. And then at the school and district level, looking to support those leadership teams and providing those same kinds of trainings and coaching and evaluation, so that we're implementing at a healthy and safe level and taking into considerations all of our students, families, and other key stakeholders that really need to be involved in making a lot of decisions. And then hopefully reaching our school leadership teams by providing that ongoing coaching and support and monitoring their implementation of key practices in those classrooms that are going to ultimately support student growth and benefit. And those students, whether they be in the classroom, whether they be online virtual learners, or some type of hybrid approach. The next slide, please. Oh, I'm sorry, nope, go back to, yes, yeah, engaging all of those stakeholders. So the Center on PBIS actually collaborated with a lot of really integral centers and leaders at the national level to help develop this guide. And really, when we're returning to school with everything that we're looking at and trying to adapt to, we want to make sure that we are connecting and really engaging those stakeholders. And our stakeholders are really looking a lot different than they used to. We talk a lot about our students, our family members. We talk about our staff members and all of the support staff in brick and mortar buildings. But now we've really needed to extend our reach into the community and thinking about those folks in the community that are providing us with some direction and making those health choices. We're making safety choices. Is it safe to return to school? If it is, what do we need to have in school? And you only achieve those levels by really reaching out and connecting with those folks and developing those relationships. There's a degree of screening that's involved in terms of what do our stakeholders need in order to be and feel supported? What are their wants? What are their fears? What can we do as a community to come together in order to move forward in this process? And again, with that ultimate goal of creating a healthy and safe learning environment for our students. So really reaching out to those stakeholders to develop those levels of supports. This past spring, many of our educators, or most of our educators, were online educators, doing that from their homes. And now we're moving into an entirely different arena, and we need to be thinking about hybrid situations, adapting those expectations and rules. Well, do they make sense to all of those stakeholders? When we're looking at creating that healthy and safe environment, what resources and supports does everyone need at that school? Thinking about everyone that has an impact on bringing those students and teachers together in order to teach. And then of course, monitoring, are we doing what we need to do in order to be effective? Constantly monitoring, are the students online in hybrid situations, are they feeling like there's a sense of community? Do they feel like they belong? If not, what can we do differently? Going back to the simple survey that a teacher did and Stephanie shared with you, what were the benefits of learning online? What can we do differently in order to make you feel like you're engaged and part of that community? And so again, it's about developing those relationships, having two-way communication in order to accurately screen and develop those resources. Next slide, please. This is a little snippet from the guide. There's guidance for the state leadership teams in transitioning. There's key considerations and things to think about prior to returning to school, what to do upon that initial return to school, and then looking at after we've been in school for a while, evaluating and gathering more information and stakeholder input in order to make those adjustments. The same is true for the guidance at that district leadership team. I've been engaged with conversations recently with districts in terms of really pulling together what do they need to do before students return, before teachers return, what do they need to do once they get up and running, and then what do we need to do afterwards? How do we sit back and evaluate if our implementation strategies were indeed effective? Next slide, please. Looking at different ways of connecting by using those critical practices, this guide offers you some really concrete suggestions that what districts can do in terms of adding to their implementation and action plans. It provides you with some examples of remote learning and how to make adaptations for in-person learning, and takes that down into considerations for all environments as well. So this guide really does provide you with some concrete suggestions about what to do prior to, during, and afterwards. Next slide. There's also a video that I wanted to point out for you all. This was a 20-minute, I believe, video. It was a guide to the guide, if you will, to help better interpret that guide and to point you in the right direction. If you need to download that guide, the link is there. It's on the PBIS.org website. And it's very, very helpful and very useful. So I hope many of you will take advantage of reaching out and learning more about what the guide has to offer as you move forward with developing your implementation plans at the district as well as at the school level. So in the chat box, one idea from today that you can incorporate into your school PBIS plan next year, this current year, to get input and feedback from your students and families. So what's one idea that you picked up from today that you could incorporate by getting some input and feedback from those students and families? Rebecca, can you read some of those for us, please?
Yep, got one coming in now. Using social media surveys on the Leon County Schools website. Victoria said QR code surveys. LaShawn said suggestion box and polls. Katie says utilizing Teams forms to survey link to website. Jane said, I like the timeline that you posted with regard to collaborating with stakeholders. Sarah says, I will design a communication survey for our parents and community support members. Michelle says, creating a student PBIS team or representative. And Margot says, suggestion box forms. Daniel said, finding out what platforms work for our parents. And Sabrina says, QR code polls, suggestion box on our website. Idris says, utilize box forms and link to website.
Great. Those are all great suggestions and recommendations. Absolutely. And I think I really like the one about determining what platform works best for our parents. Again, it's a matter of preference. Some people prefer Facebook for everything. Other people don't mind going to Twitter or to Instagram or Facebook or all three. So again, finding out what works best for your parents and your students, teachers, et cetera, is going to be most helpful. All right, so coming soon. We don't have a complete schedule for you for future TA chats, but in September, we have identified 2 really, really great TA chats that are forthcoming. So using restorative practices for reestablishing relationships with students. I think this is going to be the year of the relationship building. More so than maybe some previous years. And the other one that we have planned for you is virtual PBIS adaptations, lessons learned from this year's Gold Model Schools. We had lots of great artifacts and suggestions and ideas come forward from those schools that applied for Model School this year, and we want to share those with you. And as always, please check out our resources on our webpage, the flpbis.org, the Center on PBIS, pbis.org, the APBS, and follow us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube. And we thank you all so much for joining us today. And we hope that you will now participate in our poll so that we can better provide you with resources and supports in the future. And thank you to Laura, Stephanie, Rebecca. It's been a pleasure joining you today.